She doesn't belong here. The sentence wasn't shouted, but it carried, slipping through the soft jazz, the clink of crystal glasses, the low hum of conversations worth millions of dollars, and landing exactly where it was meant to, on the woman standing just beyond the velvet rope as Naomi Carter paused, one hand lightly brushing the worn strap of her bag, her reflection faintly caught in the polished marble beneath her feet, while the grand ballroom stretched ahead in gold light and quiet power, chandeliers glowing like suspended constellations, tailored suits and silk gowns moving in practiced elegance, a world that had once rejected her without a second thought, and for a brief second the air seemed to tighten around her as if the building itself remembered, as if it whispered back the version of her that had stood here years ago with hope folded neatly into trembling hands, a younger Naomi who had asked for a chance, just one, her voice barely steady, only to be met with polite smiles that didn't reach the eyes and a firm instruction to leave through the side entrance, not the front, never the front, because appearances mattered, and she hadn't been the right one. Not the right look, not the right background, not the right story. But that memory didn't break her now. It sharpened her, grounding her feet in a way nothing else could as the security guard stepped closer, professional, controlled, his hand hovering just enough to signal authority without making a scene. "Ma'am, this is a private event," he said, and Naomi finally lifted her gaze, calm, steady, not defiant, not pleading, just present, as if she had already walked through this moment before, as if she knew exactly how it would unfold. "I know," she replied softly, her voice almost blending into the music, yet somehow clearer than anything else in the room, and that was when a few nearby guests began to notice, their conversations slowing, eyes flickering toward her not out of recognition but curiosity, the kind that comes when something doesn't quite fit the expected picture, and Naomi felt it. The weight of their assumptions, the quiet calculations, the silent question of how someone like her had even reached this point, and instead of shrinking, she took a single step forward, heels tapping once against the marble like a punctuation mark, subtle but impossible to ignore. "You're going to have to step back," the guard added, firmer now, sensing the shift, but Naomi didn't move away. She tilted her head just slightly, studying him for a moment before letting a small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips. "What if I do belong here?" she asked, and the question didn't challenge him so much as it challenged the entire room, because it wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was certain, and certainty has a way of unsettling people more than anything else, a ripple passing through the nearby crowd, as someone let out a quiet laugh. Another whispered something behind a champagne glass, yet no one looked away, not anymore, because there was something about her composure that didn't match the narrative they had already written. Something in the way she stood, shoulders relaxed, eyes unwavering, breathing even, that suggested this moment wasn't a mistake, wasn't confusion, wasn't luck, and Naomi could feel it building, the tension, the disbelief, the curiosity curling into something sharper as she stepped past the line that had once stopped her, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, each step measured as if she had earned every inch of ground beneath her feet. And deeper inside the ballroom, beneath the glow of a chandelier that cast fractured light across polished tables, a sleek digital display flickered to life at the investor's desk, unnoticed by most but not by her, and for the first time since she arrived, Naomi's eyes shifted, not to the crowd, not to the guard, but to that screen, as if everything she had come for was already waiting there, already set in motion, and somewhere across the room, a man in a tailored black suit paused mid-conversation, his gaze lifting slowly, drawn not by her appearance, but by something far more unsettling. The feeling that he had just seen a moment that wasn't supposed to happen, and that it was only the beginning. The screen's soft glow reflected in Naomi Carter's eyes as she approached the investor's desk, her heels marking a steady rhythm across the marble while the conversations behind her thinned into a low, uncertain murmur, the kind that happens when a room begins to realize something is shifting but cannot yet explain why, and the assistant stationed at the terminal glanced up with a polite, practiced smile that faltered almost instantly as she took Naomi in from head to toe, not rudely, not openly dismissive, but with that subtle hesitation that had followed Naomi her entire life. The silent question of legitimacy, of belonging, of worth. "Can I help you?" the assistant asked, her tone carefully neutral, and Naomi nodded once, placing her hand lightly on the edge of the desk as if she had done this 1,000 times before. "I would like to fund the Westbridge development," she said, her voice even, unhurried, and for a fraction of a second nothing happened, as if the words needed time to settle into the room before anyone could respond. Then the assistant blinked, fingers hovering above the keyboard. "I am sorry. That opportunity is reserved for private investors," she replied gently, almost apologetically, and Naomi's expression did not change. Not a flicker of frustration or embarrassment, only a quiet certainty that made the assistant hesitate again. "I understand," Naomi said, reaching into her bag with deliberate calm, drawing out a slim black card that caught the chandelier light without flashing, without demanding attention, yet somehow commanding it. "Anyway, please process $3 million, she added, sliding the card forward with a soft, precise motion that echoed louder than it should have, and this time the silence was immediate, heavier, the kind that pulls people in before they realize they are listening, the assistant's eyes widening just slightly before she masked it, nodding as she took the card, typing carefully, double-checking the screen as if expecting an error to appear. But none did, and across the room, a cluster of guests shifted closer, their curiosity no longer hidden, their conversations dissolving into whispers as the number appeared in clean, undeniable digits on the display. 3 million. Not promised, not discussed. Already authorized, already real, and the assistant swallowed, her posture adjusting almost imperceptibly. "The transaction is approved," she said, her voice quieter now, more measured, as if she were suddenly aware of the weight behind the moment, and Naomi gave a small nod, not triumphant, not relieved, simply acknowledging what she had always known would happen, but behind her, the reaction spread like a slow ripple, disbelief turning into calculation, calculation into unease, because money at that level did not just appear, not without a story, not without a name attached to it, and that was when the familiar voice cut through the tension, sharper now, edged with something that sounded dangerously close to desperation. "That is not her money." The former manager stepped forward, his smile tight, controlled, but his eyes searching for agreement from the crowd, for validation, for anything that would restore the version of reality he understood. "I remember her," he continued, his voice carrying just enough. "She worked here. She could barely hold a position. This is some kind of arrangement," and a few heads nodded instinctively, clinging to the explanation because it was easier, safer, but Naomi did not turn immediately. She let the words settle, let them exist without interrupting them, her gaze still resting on the screen as if none of it could reach her. And when she finally looked back over her shoulder, her expression remained unchanged, calm, almost gentle. "Does it matter where the money comes from if it builds something real?" she asked, and the question landed differently than expected, not defensive, not confrontational, but reflective, forcing the room to pause again, because it challenged more than her legitimacy. It challenged theirs, and for the first time, the manager hesitated, his certainty cracking just enough to be seen, while across the ballroom, the man in the tailored black suit had stopped moving entirely, his attention fixed now not on the transaction, not on the crowd, but on Naomi herself, as if he were watching a memory unfold in real time, something unfinished, something returning, and the air shifted once more, quieter, heavier, waiting for something no one had planned for. The question lingered in the air, quiet but impossible to ignore, and for a moment no one answered Naomi Carter, not because they could not, but because they were no longer certain they should, the room shifting from judgment into something far more fragile, uncertainty, while the former manager forced a small laugh that did not quite land, his confidence thinning under the weight of the moment as he adjusted his cuff and stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to seem composed but loud. "Enough to keep control of the narrative. It matters because transparency matters," he said, each word measured, as if he were rebuilding authority piece by piece. "This kind of money does not just appear without someone standing behind it," and that word, behind, seemed to echo longer than the rest, catching the attention of those already leaning in, because now the story was no longer about whether Naomi belonged. It was about who might be standing behind her, and Naomi let the silence stretch again before she responded, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged. "You are right," she said softly, and the agreement startled him more than defiance would have, because it removed the ground he was preparing to stand on. "Someone is standing behind it," she continued, her tone calm, almost reflective, as if she were stating something obvious rather than revealing something significant, and the shift was immediate. The whispers sharpening, curiosity turning into anticipation, the kind that makes people forget their drinks, forget their conversations, forget even themselves, all eyes narrowing toward her as if trying to solve her before she could speak again. But Naomi did not rush. She turned back toward the screen, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk, grounding herself not in the room, not in their expectations, but in something far older, something that lived beyond this night, beyond this building, beyond the polished surfaces and carefully curated reputations, and for the first time her voice carried a trace of something deeper, not vulnerability, not hesitation, but memory. "There was a night," she said, not looking at anyone in particular, yet somehow speaking to all of them, "when none of this mattered, not the money, not the titles, not the invitations," and the room grew still again, the kind of stillness that feels intentional, like a held breath shared by dozens of people at once, while across the ballroom the man in the black suit shifted slightly, his attention sharpening, as if he already knew where this was going but could not stop it, could not interrupt it, could only witness it unfold. "I remember standing outside a building just like this," Naomi continued, her eyes lifting slightly now, not to meet anyone's gaze but to look past them, into something only she could see. "I was told I did not belong, that I did not fit, that I should leave before I embarrassed myself," and a faint ripple moved through the crowd, subtle, uneasy, because the story was beginning to sound familiar in a way that felt uncomfortable, as if it were holding up a mirror they had not agreed to look into. And the former manager shifted again, his jaw tightening, his confidence slipping just enough to show, "That is not relevant." He interrupted quickly, but Naomi did not acknowledge him, did not break the flow, because for the first time she was not speaking to prove anything. She was speaking because the truth had reached the surface and could not be pushed back down. "But someone saw me," she said, and now her voice softened, not weaker, but steadier, anchored in something real. "Not for what I looked like, not for where I came from, but for what I could become." And that was when the air changed again, not with noise, not with movement, but with presence, a subtle shift that moved through the room like a current as conversations fully died, as attention sharpened into something almost reverent, because they could feel it now, something approaching, something inevitable, and slowly, deliberately. Naomi turned her head toward the far end of the ballroom, her eyes settling on the entrance where the doors stood closed just moments before, and though no one had yet spoken, no one had yet moved, the entire room seemed to follow her gaze instinctively, drawn toward the same point. Waiting without understanding why, while the man in the black suit finally took a single step forward, his expression no longer neutral, no longer distant, but carrying something unmistakable, recognition, and something else beneath it, something quieter, something heavier, something that suggested this moment had been waiting to happen far longer than anyone in that room realized. No one spoke, not even the man who had been so certain just seconds ago, because the silence had shifted into something else now, something heavier, something that felt like it was waiting for permission to break, and Naomi Carter did not rush it. She stood there with the same steady posture, her hand resting lightly against the edge of the desk, her breathing even, her eyes fixed toward the far end of the ballroom as if she had already seen what was about to happen long before anyone else could sense it. And then it came, not as a loud interruption, not as a dramatic announcement, but as a quiet change in the room's rhythm, the doors opening with a soft, controlled movement that barely made a sound, yet somehow drew every gaze without effort, conversations that had already faded now completely gone, glasses paused midair, shoulders turning instinctively as a single figure stepped inside, tall, composed, his presence carrying a weight that did not need introduction, because everyone in that room knew exactly who he was, even before his name formed in their minds. William Ashford, a man whose reputation moved faster than his voice, whose decisions shaped entire industries, and yet in this moment he did not look at the crowd, did not acknowledge the attention. His focus locked onto one person, and one person only, Naomi. And there was something in that look that did not match the polished world around them, something personal, something unresolved, something that reached far beyond this night, and the former manager felt it before he understood it, his confidence faltering as he straightened unconsciously, his earlier certainty dissolving into something far less stable, because this was not part of his version of events, not something he could explain away or control, and Naomi did not move, did not step forward, did not step back. She simply held his gaze as if this was not an arrival but a continuation, as if this moment had been paused years ago and was only now resuming, and William slowed as he approached, not hesitant, but deliberate, each step measured, the quiet sound of his shoes against the marble floor echoing in a way that felt louder than it should, until he stopped just a few feet away from her, the distance close enough to confirm what the room was already beginning to suspect, yet far enough to hold the tension in place. And for a second neither of them spoke, not because they had nothing to say, but because the weight of what existed between them did not need to be rushed into words. And then Naomi tilted her head slightly, her expression unchanged, her voice calm when it finally came. "You're late," she said, and a faint ripple moved through the crowd, confusion mixing with disbelief. Because no one spoke to William Ashford that way. Not here. Not ever. And yet, he did not react with offense, did not correct her, did not reclaim control of the moment. Instead, something almost unnoticeable shifted in his expression, not a smile, not quite, but something softer, something that belonged to a different version of him than the one the world recognized. "I had to make sure everything was ready," he replied, his voice low but steady, carrying easily across the silent room. And now the tension sharpened, because this was no longer speculation, no longer theory. It was confirmation unfolding in real time, and the former manager took a step forward, unable to hold back, his voice tight, controlled but edged with urgency. "Mr. Ashford, I believe there is some misunderstanding," he said, trying to anchor himself back into authority, into logic, into something he could still grasp. But William did not look at him, not even for a moment, his attention remaining fixed on Naomi, as if the rest of the room had faded into nothing. And that was when the realization landed, not all at once, but in fragments, in glances exchanged between guests, in the way people shifted their stance, in the quiet recalculations happening behind composed expressions, because the question was no longer whether Naomi belonged. The question was how long she had belonged without them ever noticing, and Naomi let the moment settle, let it breathe, before she spoke again, her voice steady, grounded. "You told me once that timing matters more than opportunity," she said, her eyes holding his, and William gave a slight nod, not as a performance, not for the room, but as acknowledgement. "It does," he replied, and something in the way he said it made the air tighten again, because this was no longer just a reunion, it was a reveal, one that had layers no one in that room fully understood yet. And Naomi took a small step forward, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance, not behind him, not beneath him, but beside him, her presence equal, undeniable, and for the first time since she entered, the room saw it clearly, not the past version of her, not the assumptions they had made, but the truth standing in front of them. And still, they did not know the full story, not yet, not even close. The room did not return to normal, not after that. Because once something unseen becomes visible, it does not disappear again. It lingers. It reshapes everything around it. And now every eye in that ballroom moved between Naomi Carter and William Ashford, trying to reconstruct a story they had clearly missed, trying to understand how a woman they had dismissed minutes ago was now standing beside a man they could not ignore. And yet neither of them rushed to explain it. Neither of them offered the clarity the room so desperately wanted, because the truth did not belong to the crowd, it belonged to them. And Naomi could feel the weight of those stares pressing in, the curiosity, the disbelief, the quiet discomfort of people realizing their assumptions had been wrong, not just tonight, but for far longer than they would admit, and still she remained composed, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, not seeking approval, not reacting to judgment, simply present in a way that made it impossible to look away, while William finally shifted his attention, not toward the crowd as a whole, but toward the former manager, who had now gone. Uncharacteristically silent, his earlier confidence replaced by a tight uncertainty he could not quite hide. "You said transparency matters," William spoke at last, his voice calm but carrying an authority that settled the room instantly, and the manager straightened instinctively, nodding quickly as if reclaiming ground. "Yes, of course it does," he replied, though his tone lacked the certainty it had before, and William gave a slight nod, acknowledging the statement without endorsing it. "Then let us be transparent," he continued, and the words did not sound like a suggestion. They sounded like a decision already made, and a subtle tension moved through the crowd again, because something was about to be revealed, something that would not allow them to return to the comfort of not knowing, and Naomi watched him for a brief moment, not surprised, not uncertain, just aware, as if she had already anticipated this turn, already accepted it, and yet there was something in her eyes now. Something quieter, something that suggested this was not just about proving a point, not just about shifting perception, but about closing something that had been left open for too long, and William turned slightly, gesturing toward the screen where the transaction still glowed in clean, undeniable numbers. $3 million, he said almost thoughtfully, is a very small number when you understand what it represents. And a few people exchanged glances, confused, intrigued, because the statement did not align with the scale they were used to measuring, and he continued before anyone could interrupt. It represents trust, risk, and something far more rare than either of those. His gaze returning to Naomi, steady, direct. It represents belief, and the words settled into the room differently than the others, softer but heavier, because it carried something they could not quantify. And Naomi let out a slow breath, almost imperceptible, not from relief, not from tension, but from recognition, as if she had heard those words before, in a different place, in a different time, and the memory passed through her without breaking her composure, while the manager stepped forward again. Unable to let the moment move beyond him, "Mr. Ashford, with all respect, this still does not explain her position here tonight," he said, the edge in his voice returning, though thinner now, more fragile, and William finally looked at him, not with irritation, not with dismissal, but with a calm clarity that made the answer feel inevitable before it was even spoken. "Her position here," he repeated, as if considering the phrasing itself, and then he gave a small, almost reflective nod. "She is not here because of me," he said, and the statement landed like a quiet disruption, subtle but undeniable, because it shifted the entire foundation of what they had assumed, and Naomi's gaze flickered for the first time, just briefly, not in disagreement, not in surprise, but in acknowledgement of something deeper, something the room still did not understand, and William continued, his voice steady. "If anything, I am here because of her." And this time the silence that followed was complete, not a whisper, not a movement, just the sound of a room realizing it had been asking the wrong question all along, and Naomi finally turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting his again, and in that look there was no hierarchy, no dependence, no need to define what existed between them, only a shared understanding that whatever story the room was trying to piece together, it had only just begun, and it was far more complicated than any of them were prepared to hear. The silence did not break immediately, it stretched, deepened, settled into the kind of quiet that forces people to confront what they have just heard, and for the first time that evening, the room was no longer trying to judge Naomi Carter, it was trying to understand her, and that shift was far more powerful than any approval they could have given, because understanding requires letting go of certainty, and certainty had been the foundation of how they saw her, and now that foundation was gone, leaving behind something unfamiliar, something uncomfortable, while Naomi stood still within it, not rushing to fill the silence, not softening the moment for anyone else, her presence steady, grounded, as if she had already lived through this outcome long before it arrived, and William Ashford did not speak again right away either, his words still hanging in the air, reshaping the room one realization at a time, because what he had said could not be undone, could not be reinterpreted into something easier. It had shifted the narrative completely, and now every glance, every whisper carried a different tone, no longer dismissive, no longer amused, but searching, almost cautious, as if everyone were recalibrating how close they stood to something they did not yet fully understand, and the former manager felt it more than anyone, the subtle loss of control, the slow erosion of the version of reality he had been defending, and he tried to recover it, stepping forward again, his posture straight, his voice measured. "Then explain it," he said, not aggressively, but with a controlled insistence that revealed how much he needed an answer to restore balance. "Explain how she fits into this." And the request hung there, direct, unavoidable, drawing the attention back to Naomi, because now the question was no longer about permission, it was about truth, and Naomi turned slightly, her gaze shifting from William to the manager, not with resentment, not with triumph, but with a quiet clarity that made the moment feel less like a confrontation and more like a resolution waiting to happen. And when she spoke, her voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It remained even, almost reflective. "I do not fit into this," she said, and the simplicity of the statement caught them off guard, because it did not defend, did not argue. It reframed everything, and a few people exchanged uncertain looks, unsure if they had just heard humility or something far more deliberate, and Naomi continued before anyone could respond, her tone steady. "This was never built for someone like me," she added, her eyes moving briefly across the room, not accusing, not bitter, just acknowledging what had always been true, and there was no hostility in her words, only honesty, the kind that does not seek approval, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to challenge, because it did not attack anyone directly, it simply revealed what had been quietly accepted for years, and the manager opened his mouth as if to respond, then hesitated, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to deny without exposing something deeper, and Naomi let that moment pass, not pressing him, not forcing the issue, because this was not about winning an argument, it was about shifting something fundamental, something that could not be undone once seen. And she turned her attention back toward William, her expression softening just slightly, not in weakness, but in recognition. "But you told me something different," she said, and her voice carried a subtle shift now, something more personal, something that did not belong to the room, and William met her gaze without hesitation, his expression unchanged yet undeniably present, as if this part of the conversation existed outside of everyone else. "I told you that the system only works until someone refuses to follow it," he replied, his tone calm. But the words carried weight, the kind that comes from experience rather than theory, and Naomi gave a faint nod, almost imperceptible, as if confirming something she had already known, already tested, already proven in ways the room could not yet see, and behind them, the crowd leaned in again, drawn not by spectacle now, but by the quiet intensity of something real unfolding, something that did not rely on performance or approval, and Naomi took a slow breath, her shoulders settling as if a decision had just been made, not tonight, not in this moment, but long before she ever walked through those doors. And when she spoke again, her voice carried that decision with it, clear, grounded, undeniable. "So, I stopped asking to belong," she said, and the words did not echo. They landed, firm and complete, because they were not meant to persuade anyone. They were meant to declare something that no one in that room could take away from her. And for the first time since the night began, the power in the room shifted fully, not because of the money, not because of William's presence, but because Naomi no longer needed either of them to stand where she stood, and that was something no one there knew how to challenge. The words did not fade, they settled, anchoring themselves into the room with a weight that no one could easily dismiss, and for a moment it felt as if everything had paused just long enough for people to realize that what they were witnessing was not a performance, not a calculated display, but something far more unsettling, something real, and Naomi Carter did not move to soften it, did not step back into something more comfortable for them, because comfort had never been something she was offered, and she had learned long ago that clarity mattered more than acceptance, while William Ashford remained beside her, not ahead of her, not speaking for her, his presence no longer dominating the space but reinforcing what had already become undeniable, and the crowd felt it, that subtle shift where power no longer came from status alone but from something quieter, something internal, something they could not replicate simply by standing in the same room, and it made them uneasy, because it meant the rules they relied on were not as fixed as they believed, and the former manager, still caught between denial and realization, tried once more to hold onto what he could understand, his voice tighter now, less certain. "You are saying you chose not to belong," he said, as if repeating it might make it less disruptive, more explainable, and Naomi turned her gaze toward him again, not with impatience, not with judgment, but with a calm steadiness that left no space for misinterpretation. "No," she replied, her voice quiet but clear. "I am saying I realized I never needed permission," and the difference between the two landed slowly, but when it did, it shifted something deeper than before, because it was not just about rejection or acceptance, it was about independence from both. And that idea did not sit easily with a room built on approval, built on access, built on invisible doors that decided who entered and who remained outside, and a few guests shifted uncomfortably, their expressions carefully neutral, yet their eyes revealing the recalculations happening beneath the surface, because if what she said was true, then everything they had used to define worth might not be as reliable as they believed, and Naomi let that realization breathe, not forcing it, not explaining it further, because she knew something they were only beginning to understand, that truth does not need to be repeated to be effective, it only needs to be seen once, and it changes the way everything else is viewed. While William finally spoke again, his tone even, but carrying a quiet gravity that drew attention without effort. "There are rooms like this all over the country," he said, his gaze moving briefly across the crowd, not accusing, not dismissing, simply observing. "And they all operate the same way. They decide who is worthy before they ever speak to them," and no one interrupted him, because no one could deny it without exposing themselves, and he continued, his voice steady. "But every once in a while, someone walks in who is never meant to follow those rules," and his eyes returned to Naomi, not with admiration that placed her above him, but with acknowledgement that placed her beside him, and Naomi did not react to the statement outwardly, but there was a quiet understanding in the way she held his gaze, because this was not new to her, not a realization that had just formed tonight, but something she had built piece by piece, decision by decision, long before anyone in this room had noticed her, and the former manager lowered his voice slightly, as if the shift in tone might regain some control. "Even so, that does not explain how you went from being turned away to standing here now," he said, and this time his question carried less challenge and more genuine confusion, because the gap between those two realities no longer made sense to him, and Naomi took a slow breath, her shoulders settling as if she had reached the part of the story that mattered most, the part that could not be reduced to a single moment or a single decision, and when she spoke, her voice carried something deeper than before, something that reached beyond the room itself. "Because I stopped trying to prove them wrong," she said, and a subtle shift moved through the crowd again, quieter this time, more reflective, because it was not the answer they expected, not the narrative they were prepared to follow, and she continued, her tone steady, grounded. "I started building something that did not require their approval in the first place," and the words settled differently than anything else she had said that night, because they were not about this room, not about this event, not about the people standing in front of her. They were about something larger, something that existed whether or not this room recognized it. And that realization changed everything, because for the first time it became clear that Naomi Carter had not returned to this place to be accepted. She had returned because she no longer needed to be, and that was a kind of power the room did not know how to measure. The realization did not explode. It unfolded, quietly and steadily, like something that had been waiting beneath the surface for years, and now that it had been spoken, no one in the room could unhear it. No one could return to the version of Naomi Carter they had formed just moments ago, because that version no longer existed, and perhaps it never truly had, and the crowd felt it. That subtle discomfort when certainty is replaced with something far less stable, something that requires reflection instead of reaction. And for the first time that evening, no one interrupted her, no one laughed, no one dismissed her presence as an accident, because they could not anymore, and Naomi stood in the center of it all, not elevated by attention, not changed by recognition, but anchored in something far deeper, something that had been built long before this room ever acknowledged her. While William Ashford remained beside her, silent now, his role no longer to reveal, but to confirm what had already been made undeniable, and the former manager, who had once defined her place with a single glance, now struggled to find where he stood in relation to her, his voice quieter when it came, almost careful. "If that is true," he said, choosing each word with a precision that revealed his uncertainty, "then why come back here at all?" And the question did not carry accusation this time. It carried confusion, genuine and unguarded, because he no longer knew how to frame her actions within the system he understood, and Naomi turned toward him fully, not defensive, not dismissive, but present, as if she respected the question even if she had already lived the answer. And for a brief moment she did not speak, letting the silence settle, letting the weight of the room gather around that single question, because it mattered, not just to him, but to everyone watching, everyone recalibrating what they thought they knew. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried a quiet clarity that felt almost unexpected after everything that had been revealed. "I did not come back for this room," she said, her eyes moving across the space, not with resentment, not with longing, but with recognition of what it represented. "I came back because there are still people standing outside it." And the words shifted the focus again, away from her, away from the spectacle of her return, and towards something larger, something that existed beyond the polished floors and controlled conversations. And a subtle ripple moved through the crowd, not as loud as before, but deeper, more reflective, because they understood what she meant even if they did not want to admit it. And Naomi continued, her tone steady, grounded. "People who are told they do not belong before they are ever given a chance to prove otherwise." And there was no accusation in her voice, only truth, the kind that does not need to be sharpened to cut. And the former manager looked at her differently now, not as someone beneath him, not even as someone equal, but as someone he did not fully understand, and that unsettled him more than anything else had that night. While William finally shifted slightly, his gaze following Naomi as she spoke, not leading her, not guiding her, but acknowledging the direction she had chosen, and the room listened, not out of politeness, not out of obligation, but because something about her words made it impossible not to. And Naomi took a slow breath, her shoulders relaxed, her posture unchanged. "This investment," she said, gesturing lightly toward the screen without turning to look at it, "is not about being seen here." And the simplicity of the statement contrasted with the weight it carried, because everyone in that room had spent years trying to be seen in spaces like this, and she was standing there saying it did not matter, and that alone disrupted more than any amount of money could. And she continued, her voice steady, "It is about building something that does not depend on rooms like this to exist." And the words landed with a quiet finality, because they redefined the purpose of everything that had happened that night, turning it from a moment of personal validation into something far more intentional, something far more lasting. And the crowd felt it, the shift from spectacle to meaning, from curiosity to something closer to respect, not the kind that is given freely, but the kind that forms slowly, reluctantly, when there is no longer a reason to deny it. And Naomi did not look for that respect, did not wait for it, because she had already moved beyond needing it, and that was what made it real, what made it impossible to take away. And as the silence settled once more, deeper now, more complete, it became clear to everyone in that room that this was no longer just a return. It was a redefinition, not only of who Naomi Carter was, but of what it meant to belong in the first place. And still, even after everything that had been revealed, there was a sense that something remained unsaid, something deeper, something that had yet to fully surface. And the room, whether it realized it or not, was waiting for it. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt full, as if the room itself was holding something back, waiting for a piece that had not yet been revealed. and Naomi Carter could sense it in the way people stood now, no longer leaning away from her, no longer dismissing her presence, but leaning in, drawn by something they could not fully name, while William Ashford remained still beside her, his earlier words still echoing beneath everything that had been said since, shaping the way the room now viewed her, not as someone who had been allowed in, but as someone who had always been part of something larger, something they had simply failed to see. And yet, even with all that had shifted, there was still a question, hanging unspoken in the air, one that had not yet been answered, one that had not yet been fully understood, and it lingered in the way eyes moved between them, in the quiet tension that had not completely dissolved, because understanding her presence was one thing, but understanding how it all began was something else entirely, and the former manager, though quieter now, felt it pressing against him, that need for clarity, not to regain control this time, but to make sense of something that no longer fit into the boundaries he had relied on, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of the sharpness it once had, only a cautious curiosity. "What did she do?" he asked, not looking at Naomi this time, but at William, because the answer he was seeking no longer belonged to the present. It belonged to something before all of this, something that had shaped everything they were now witnessing. And for a moment William did not respond, not out of hesitation, but out of consideration, as if the weight of that question required more than a simple answer, and Naomi did not interrupt him, did not step in, because she understood that some truths needed to be spoken by the person who had carried them, and the room grew still again, quieter than before, as if everyone instinctively knew they were about to hear something that would change the meaning of everything that had happened tonight. And when William finally spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something different beneath it now, something less distant, less controlled, something that belonged to a version of him the world rarely saw. "She reminded me of something I had forgotten," he said, and the simplicity of the sentence did not match the weight it carried, because it did not explain. It opened something deeper, and the former manager frowned slightly, trying to understand, but before he could ask again, William continued, his gaze shifting briefly, not away from Naomi, but through her, as if looking at a moment that existed somewhere behind her. "There was a time when I believed that success was about control," he said, his tone calm, reflective, control over outcomes, over people, over risk, and a few people in the room shifted subtly, recognizing the language, the mindset, the very system they had built their own lives around, and William let that settle before continuing. "And then there was a moment when none of that mattered," he added, and now the room leaned in again, not because of the story itself, but because of the shift in his voice, the way it carried something personal, something unguarded. And Naomi remained still, her expression unchanged. Yet there was a quiet understanding in her eyes, as if she already knew where this was going, as if she had lived that moment from the other side. And William took a slow breath, not to steady himself, but to choose his next words carefully. "I was in a place where everything I had built meant nothing," he said, and though he did not describe it in detail, the weight of the statement was enough, because it was not about the place itself. It was about the realization, the collapse of certainty, the moment when control no longer applied, and the room listened differently now, not as observers, but as witnesses to something that could not be reduced to numbers or titles. And William's voice softened just slightly, not weaker, but more precise. "And she did not ask who I was," he said, his eyes returning fully to Naomi now. "She did not care about what I had or what I represented," and the meaning settled in layers, because in a room where identity was everything, where status defined every interaction, the idea of being seen without it felt almost foreign, almost impossible, and Naomi's gaze held his, steady, grounded, not reacting, not confirming, simply allowing the truth to exist without interruption. And the former manager shifted again, his earlier assumptions unraveling piece by piece as he tried to reconcile the version of Naomi he had known with the one standing in front of him now. And William finished the thought with a quiet clarity that left no room for doubt. "She saw me when none of this existed," he said, and the room fell completely silent, not because they did not understand, but because they finally did, and in that understanding, everything changed once again, because it was no longer about how Naomi had entered the room. It was about why she had never needed to. The silence that followed his words was not the kind that fades. It settled deeper, heavier, as if the entire room had been forced to step outside of itself for just a moment, to see something beyond status, beyond money, beyond the polished image they had all carefully constructed, and Naomi Carter did not break it. She allowed it to exist, because this part of the story had never belonged to her alone. It had always belonged to the truth of that moment, the one William Ashford had just begun to reveal, and for the first time since the night began, the room was not watching Naomi as a disruption. They were watching her as an answer to something they had never thought to question, while William remained still, his presence no longer commanding attention through power, but through something quieter, something grounded in memory, and he continued, not to impress them, not to justify anything, but because the truth had already been opened and could not be left unfinished. It was not a boardroom. It was not an office. It was not a place anyone here would recognize, he said, his voice calm, but carrying a clarity that drew everyone in. It was a moment where everything that usually matters did not apply, and a subtle shift moved through the crowd again, because they could feel the distance between that moment and this room, the contrast between what they valued and what he was describing, and Naomi's gaze remained steady, her expression unchanged, yet there was a quiet familiarity in her eyes, as if she had walked through that memory long ago and left it exactly where it belonged. And William continued, his tone even. I expected to be treated like someone who could solve the situation, someone who could fix it with influence or resources, and a faint tension passed through the room, because that expectation felt familiar, almost automatic, and he gave a slight shake of his head, not in frustration, but in reflection. But she did not give me that, he said, and the words carried a quiet weight, because they revealed something far more disruptive than failure. They revealed a lack of recognition, and that, in a room like this, was almost unthinkable, and Naomi shifted her gaze slightly, not away, not avoiding, but grounding herself as the memory unfolded, because she knew exactly what he meant, not as a story, but as something she had lived, something that had never required explanation, and William's voice softened just slightly, not losing its strength, but gaining precision. She spoke to me like none of this existed, he said, his eyes meeting Naomi's. Again, like I was just another person standing in front of her, and the simplicity of the statement landed deeper than anything else, because it stripped away everything that defined him in that room, everything that defined everyone in that room, and left behind something they were not used to confronting, something equal, something human, and the former manager shifted again, his expression no longer defensive, no longer dismissive, but unsettled in a way he could not quite control because the version of Naomi he had held on to no longer aligned with what he was hearing, and the room felt it too, that slow unraveling of assumption, that quiet realization that they had all been measuring value using a system that did not account for what had just been described, and William let the silence settle again before continuing. She did not ask what I could offer, he said. She did not wait for permission to speak, and she did not hesitate to tell me what I needed to hear. And now the weight of it became clearer, because it was not just about being unseen, it was about being seen differently, seen without the filter of power, without the advantage of status, and Naomi's expression softened just slightly, not in emotion, but in recognition of something that had never needed to be explained until now, and William finished the thought with a quiet certainty that carried through the entire room. That moment changed everything I thought I understood, he said, and the statement did not feel exaggerated. It felt grounded, as if it had been tested, proven, lived through long after that moment had passed, and the crowd remained still, not because they did not have questions, but because they understood that the answers were already reshaping something deeper than curiosity. And Naomi finally took a slow breath, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, because she knew that what had just been revealed was not about her proving anything. It was about the room finally seeing what had always been there, and that realization did not need reinforcement. It only needed time to settle. And as the silence held once more, it became clear that the story was no longer unfolding. For the room's understanding, it was unfolding because it had reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden. No one moved to interrupt him. Not anymore, because something had shifted beyond curiosity into recognition, the kind that does not announce itself but settles quietly, reshaping the way everything is seen, and Naomi Carter stood within that shift without claiming it, without reacting to it, because she had never needed this room to understand her for her truth to exist, and yet now that it did, there was a weight to it. Not heavy, not burdensome, but real, undeniable, while William Ashford remained still beside her, his earlier words no longer just a story, but a bridge between two worlds that had never been meant to meet in this way, and the crowd could feel it, that they were no longer witnessing a moment of surprise, but a correction of something that had been misjudged for far too long, and the former manager, who had once spoken with certainty, now stood with a quiet tension in his posture, his expression no longer defensive, but unsettled in a way he could not hide, because the narrative he had relied on had not just been challenged, it had been dismantled, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he spoke again, his voice lower now, measured. "If that is true," he said, choosing his words carefully as if they might shift under him, "then everything I thought I understood about this place." And he stopped, not because he could not finish the sentence, but because the ending had already become clear. And Naomi watched him, not with satisfaction, not with judgment, but with a quiet awareness that this was not about him alone, this was about everyone in the room. Everyone who had once believed that belonging was something granted rather than something defined, and she let the moment breathe before responding, her voice steady, grounded. "It is not about what you understood," she said, her tone calm, not dismissive, but clarifying. "It is about what you never questioned," and the words settled deeper than anything else she had said, because they did not confront directly. They revealed indirectly, and that made them harder to resist, harder to deny. And a subtle ripple moved through the crowd again, quieter now, more introspective, because they were no longer looking at her. They were looking at themselves, at the assumptions they had carried without noticing, at the judgments they had made without reflection, and William shifted his gaze across the room once more, not to command it, not to direct it, but to acknowledge what was happening. The slow, silent recalibration of a space that had always believed itself to be fixed, and he spoke. Again, his voice even, but carrying a quiet finality. "Rooms like this do not change overnight," he said, "but they do change when someone refuses to accept them as they are," and his words did not sound like a statement. They sounded like a recognition of something already in motion, something that had begun long before this night, and would continue long after it ended, and Naomi did not respond immediately, because she did not need to. The truth of it was already visible in the way she stood, in the way the room now responded to her presence, not as an outsider, not as an exception, but as something that had always been possible, even if it had never been acknowledged. And after a moment, she turned slightly, her gaze moving once more across the space, not seeking anything, not measuring anything, simply observing, as if she were seeing it clearly for the first time, not as a barrier, not as a destination, but as a reflection of something that no longer defined her. And when she spoke again, her voice carried a quiet certainty that left no space for interpretation. "I did not come here to change this room," she said, and the simplicity of the statement caught them off guard once more, because it shifted the focus away from everything they had been processing, everything they had been trying to understand, and she continued, her tone steady, grounded. "I came here to show that it was never the only one that mattered," and the meaning settled slowly, but when it did, it reframed everything, because it removed the power they had placed in this space, in this system, in this idea of belonging that had shaped so many of their decisions, and replaced it with something far less controllable, something that existed beyond their influence. And the room felt it, that quiet loss of centrality, that realization that what they had believed to be the center was only one part of something much larger, and Naomi stood within that understanding without needing to explain it further, because she knew that some truths do not need to be argued, they only need to be seen, and once they are, they cannot be unseen. And as the silence settled once more, deeper now, more complete than before, it became clear that the story unfolding in that room was no longer about how Naomi Carter had entered it, but about how she had outgrown it long before anyone realized. The room did not return to what it had been. It could not, Because once a perspective shifts, it is not simply reset, it redefines everything that follows, and Naomi Carter stood in the center of that shift without claiming ownership of it. Without drawing attention to herself beyond what had already been made undeniable, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, as if the weight of the moment belonged more to the room than to her, while William Ashford remained beside her, not as a shield, not as a spotlight, but as a witness to something that had begun long before this night, and the crowd felt it, that quiet realization that what they had just seen was not a rise, not a transformation, but a reveal, something that had always existed beneath their assumptions, beneath their expectations, and now that it was visible, it could not be reduced or reinterpreted into something more comfortable. And the former manager, who had spent so much of the evening trying to define Naomi within the limits of his understanding, now stood without that framework, his voice absent, his posture uncertain, as if he were still searching for a version of reality that no longer applied, and Naomi did not look at him, not out of dismissal, but because her attention had already moved beyond the need to respond, beyond the need to correct, beyond the need to be seen through the lens of someone else's perspective, and after a moment, she stepped away from the desk, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate calm that had guided her every movement since she entered, her heels marking a soft rhythm against the marble as she moved through the space, and this time no one stopped her. No one questioned her presence. The invisible barriers that had once defined her path no longer existed, not because they had been removed, but because they no longer applied to her, and the crowd shifted subtly as she passed, not parting out of obligation, but out of recognition, the kind that forms when something undeniable replaces something assumed, and William watched her for a brief moment before following, not leading, not directing, but aligning with her movement. And the room remained quiet, not in tension now, but in reflection, as if each person were processing something that extended far beyond this evening, beyond this building, beyond the structures they had always relied on. And Naomi slowed near the far side of the ballroom, her gaze lifting toward the tall glass windows that framed the city beyond, lights stretching into the distance, a reminder that this room was only one part of something much larger, something far less contained, and for a moment she simply stood there, taking in the view, not as an escape, not as a conclusion, but as a continuation, and William came to a stop beside her, his presence quiet, his expression composed, yet there was something different in the way he looked at her now. Not curiosity, not admiration, but respect that did not need to be spoken to be understood. And after a brief pause, he spoke, his voice low, measured. "You could have walked away from all of this," he said, not as a question, but as an acknowledgement, and Naomi gave a faint nod, her eyes still on the city beyond the glass. "I did," she replied softly, and the simplicity of the answer carried more weight than any explanation could have, because it revealed that her presence here was not driven by need, not by validation, but by choice, and that distinction changed everything, and William considered that for a moment before speaking again. "Then why step back into it?" he asked. And this time his tone held something quieter, something more personal, because the answer mattered beyond the context of the room, and Naomi finally turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his, steady, grounded, and when she spoke, her voice carried a clarity that felt both simple and profound. "Because walking away does not change what still exists," she said, and the words settled between them, not as a challenge, not as a justification, but as a truth that required no defense, and William nodded slowly, understanding without needing further explanation, because he had lived that realization in his own way, in his own time, and the two of them stood there in quiet alignment, not defined by the room behind them, not constrained by the expectations within it, but connected by something that had formed outside of it entirely, and behind them, the crowd remained, still watching, still processing, still trying to understand how something so simple could shift something so deeply rooted. And Naomi did not turn back, did not seek their reaction because she had already moved beyond needing it, and as the city lights reflected softly in the glass, it became clear that this moment was not an ending, not a resolution, but a transition, something that had begun long ago and would continue long after this room faded into memory. And for the first time that night, The room was no longer the center of the story. It was only the place where it had finally been seen. The glass reflected more than the city. It reflected a version of Naomi Carter that no longer needed to be explained, no longer needed to be placed within anyone else's understanding, and she stood there for a moment longer, not because she was holding on to the night, but because she was letting it pass through her without resistance, without attachment, while the room behind her remained suspended in a quiet awareness, the kind that follows a realization too large to ignore. And William Ashford did not speak again, not because there was nothing left to say, but because he understood that this moment no longer required words, it required space, and Naomi finally shifted her weight slightly, turning away from the window with the same calm precision that had defined every step she had taken that evening, her gaze no longer scanning the room, no longer measuring it, simply moving through it with a quiet certainty that did not ask for recognition. And as she began to walk back across the marble floor, the subtle sound of her heels marked a rhythm that felt different now, not cautious, not restrained, but grounded, each step carrying the weight of someone who no longer needed to prove where she belonged. And the crowd responded without being told, not in applause, not in forced acknowledgement, but in the quiet shift of space, a path forming not out of obligation but out of understanding. And for the first time that night, there was no tension in their movement, no hesitation in their gaze, only a quiet recognition that what they were witnessing was not a moment of entry, but a moment of departure. And Naomi did not look at them as she passed, not out of disregard, but because she had already seen everything she needed to see, already understood everything that had once held power over her, and now that power no longer existed in the same way. And as she reached the center of the room once more, the place where she had first been stopped, first been questioned, first been measured, she paused briefly, not to reflect, not to linger, but to acknowledge the space for what it had been and what it was no longer. And the memory of that earlier moment did not return as something painful. It returned as something complete, something resolved, and without a word, she continued forward, moving past the invisible line that had once defined her limits, and toward the exit that stood open now. No guards stepping forward, no voice questioning her presence, only the quiet understanding that nothing about her presence needed to be challenged anymore. And William remained where he was for a moment, watching her go, not with distance, not with detachment, but with a recognition that mirrored the one she carried, because he understood that whatever connection existed between them did not depend on proximity, did not depend on explanation. It existed because of something that had already happened, something that could not be undone. And as Naomi reached the doorway, the city air just beyond the threshold visible through the open space, she slowed slightly, her hand brushing lightly against the frame, not hesitating, not holding back, simply acknowledging the transition from one space to another. And for a brief second, she looked back, not at any one person, not at any single point, but at the room as a whole, her expression calm, her eyes steady, and in that glance there was no triumph, no need to claim what had happened, only a quiet clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. And then she stepped forward, crossing the threshold without pause, leaving behind a room that had once defined her limits and now stood as nothing more than a place she had passed through. And as the doors remained open for just a moment longer before slowly closing, the sound of the city beyond blending into the fading echoes of the evening, it became clear to everyone inside that the story they had witnessed was not about a woman who had finally been allowed to belong. It was about a woman who had never needed to, and the space she left behind did not feel empty. It felt changed, permanently, because once a truth like that is seen, it does not disappear, it lingers, reshaping the way everything else is understood. And long after she was gone, long after the conversation slowly returned, quieter now, more thoughtful, there remained a single, undeniable realization that no one in that room could ignore, that belonging had never been something Naomi Carter found, it had always been something she defined.